Okay.
And we're live with the other Karl. Um, and you, I'm still not clear who the other Karl is. Other Karl.
Oh, okay. Okay. So to clarify, I am a YouTuber that tends to cover like third position ideas and politics on my channel, and I also cover other historical and cultural stuff.
What historical and cultural stuff do you cover?
Lately, like I'm gonna probably cover a lot more stuff concerning American history.
Aha. Uh, about the founding fathers and how five of them weren't Christian. Are you going to be covering that?
I was actually thinking about covering subcultures and how people in like especially minority groups are treated in the country.
Because you are a member of a minority group, aren't you? You're Native
Yeah,
American.
yeah, about a quarter.
Uh huh. And how have you found being a part of a minority group?
Um, I don't know. It's kind of weird because I grew up in a mixed family, and I grew up, around different people. So I never really like knew. I never really like experienced any kind of like discrimination from it. If I experienced any kind of discrimination, it was kind of more from my disability than it was from me actually being a part of any ethnic identity.
Oh right, I haven't noticed. Just I mean, I would have thought you were white, but I know you identify as Native American. Um, so, but I don't actually, I haven't actually noticed any disability in you. Perhaps that's rude of me. I don't know if you want to tell us what
Oh
it
no, it's
is.
fine. It's kind of complicated, so it's hard to say how it happened or what happened. My mother thinks it could have just been from a brain injury from abuse, or and some people could just speculate that. Like when I was 8, they speculated that it could have been autism. So who knows?
Oh, but anyway, I haven't noticed anything.
Yeah, most people don't.
Right, right, and well, I suppose it's I always find that people are confused about their identity, and this is part of I think the problem, because if you don't know who you're supposed to be, then you won't know what you're supposed to do. And I also come from a mixed background myself,
Hmm.
and when I was an adolescent and in my 20s, I it was a kind of existential pain, but as one gets older, I can, I guess we grow into our own skin. I mean, that's the only
Oh yeah.
optimistic thing I have to share. So I guess if you manage to survive your teens and your 20s without killing yourself, then I guess you might be okay for a while if you survive that, maybe.
Yeah, sadly, I only got 5 years left of my 30s, though.
Uh huh. But I think, I mean, okay, I don't mind. I mean, I'm no spring chicken, but I still
No.
find, don't agree with me so readily. So I don't know. I mean, really, I used to be, more miserable and more pessimistic before, and
Same.
I don't know. I have no reason to explain to myself why I'm cheering up when things are actually getting worse, as far as I can tell.
Well, the way I look at it is things got to get worse before they get better. Because if you look at like any revolution or any uprising, there's always things always turn to shit before positive change happens sometimes.
Yes, they say it is always darkest before dawn, and
Hmm.
I suppose without darkness there would be no dawn. There would be no distinction between night and day. And do you think we are approaching this terrible situation where the government might change because its internal contradictions are too much for it to bear?
Well, I know in the United States, it's we're facing with tons of contradictions. It's funny because on one hand they'll say that Joe Biden is the most voted for president, and now like all I find is articles talking about he did this wrong, he did that wrong. We're not sure about this, we're not sure about that. But Orange Man bad, am I right?
Yeah, Orange Man's still bad. But I think that the reason Trump and his supporters are treated as heretics is because he and his supporters dare to reject the so called benefits of neoliberalism and neoconservatism, which is, I guess, basically what the American empire is all about.
Mhm.
Do you think, but perhaps Americans, we were talking about identity, and it doesn't appear that Americans think they have an empire. I mean, it's hard to know what the well, there are so many Americans, and if you don't think of yourself as an empire, you won't, I guess, have the right mindset in which to maintain it, I suppose. Do
Well,
you think
I just
America is an empire?
yeah, it is, but it's also just kind of accurate to see, some senile old person as the figurehead of this country because I think who we have in charge of our country perfectly represents, where we're at right now.
Yes, it's a bit gloomy, and I can understand, in a way, why the statue toppling started, because it's sort of rage and hatred at the stupidity of the people representing us. That somehow it has to take some, violent physical form, or doing some symbolic gesture. Um, did you see any statues being toppled around where you live?
Not in my city, but I know in Portland they even like desecrated a statue that was just a deer. Like they burned it and tore it down when it had nothing to do with like anything they were going up against. Because most of these people are protesting against, racism, colonialism, and things of that nature. Because like there's a lot of people that say that, they represent, Native Americans, and they try to say, Turtle Island, stolen land, and all that
What is
stuff.
Turtle Island? I'm afraid I don't get that reference.
Some people like to say that the United States was called Turtle Island before the settlers came in.
Right, and there were lots of turtles until the white people ate them or something.
Well, it's just kind of symbolic of the shape of the country or something, but I don't
Oh,
think every tribe said that. I mean, it's just kind of painting, all these tribes with a broad brush because they all had like different religions, different languages, different customs, different cultures.
and they were fighting each other too, weren't they?
Oh, yeah, like the tribe I came from, they were fighting against the Crow tribe constantly.
What tribe do you come from?
The Lakota tribe.
The Lakota tribe. Perhaps you can explain a little bit about the identity of the Lakota tribe.
From what I've read, they were a very matriarchal tribe, so they didn't really believe in the patriarchy, and it didn't really become more patriarchal. Like I guess even when it was like in a time of war, I wouldn't say the society itself was patriarchal. It's just that the you had the chiefs and people like Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull have to fight for their nation, but one of the things that I liked about the culture is that they considered lies a crime. So if you were like a really dishonest person, you could just be either exiled from the tribe or punished by death.
Ah,
And a
I mean,
private,
yes.
yeah. Oh, one last thing. Private property also was a concept that did not exist within the tribal nation.
So it was a quite an egalitarian society, would you say?
Yes, yeah, very egalitarian and matriarchal at the same time.
Yes, I suppose egalitarian societies would be matriarchal, and vice versa. And maybe hierarchical societies would be patriarchal, but I suppose the advantage of that has been clear from what the Europeans managed to do, that hierarchical societies are more uh, organized and perhaps, well, militarily efficient.
Yeah.
And would you say that the Native American generally were matriarchal societies?
No, there are some tribes that were actually very patriarchal.
Oh, which ones?
I can't remember off the top of my head because I'd have to brush up on the history of these different tribes. But there were a few out there that were very patriarchal, and some of to patriarchal to the point that women were just property to them. But you won't hear any leftists say that because leftists always just kind of have like a um, they always kind of tint history more to suit their agenda, so to speak.
And these patriarchal societies, were they the um, top tribes, or I mean, how were they in the pecking order of Native American tribes?
They were a lot lesser known, and they were usually not that big. So there was a few of them out there, but like I said, there it'd be something I'd have to go back into and read. But I just know that they did exist, and leftists will, they'll try to say that they didn't, but I don't really expect leftists to ever be that honest about much.
So, what who were the biggest? Which were the biggest and most powerful tribes off the top of? I mean, I can think of the Cherokee, but then I'm thinking also about the Jeep. So
Well, the most well-known tribes would, of course, be my tribe, the Apache.
right.
That's where Geronimo came from.
Uh huh.
You had the Navajo, you had you had the Iroquois. You also had and I know in my state, in the north of the state, you had the Nez Perce that covered like eastern Oregon and southern Washington.
And do all these tribes now have their own reservation
Yeah.
and run casinos? I know so little, so I wouldn't mind.
Well, yeah, like the state I live in has several reservations. Like you have the Warm Springs reservation, the Umpqua, you have you have the one in Umatilla County. You So you have the Grand Ronde reservation, which is just like one county up from where I live. So you have several. I mean, I actually had to go to the Grand Ronde reservation to get some dental work because um, the local dentists weren't really doing such a good job, and I had to get a few teeth pulled, so I had to go up there.
Right, right. And does it operate okay? Yeah, do you find it funny that white people, that they're kind of asking for their own reservation now, aren't they?
That's
I
ridiculous.
know.
I don't think they want those living conditions because see the problem is like when you're shut off from the majority, you end up becoming like a second or third class citizen. And once you become a second or third class citizen, people can decide and pick and choose what kind of resources they want to share with you. So if they don't want to share infrastructure, food, or other resources, then you're going to be dirt ass poor and you're not going to get much. So when these like white nats say, "Oh, I want my ethno state in these states here and there," it's like, well, you realize that your neighbors don't have to share much with you if they don't want to, and you guys just assume that because you're supposedly high IQ individuals, it's all going to just work out fine and dandy, but it's not going to work out too well for them if they. I mean, it's going to end up their ethno states are going to end up like Moldova or some shit like that.
But the thing is, Richard Spencer can't even work out. I mean, he hasn't chosen. I mean, imagine if they said, "Okay, Richard, you can choose your ethno state. Where's it gonna be?" And where? I mean, where would he? I bet he'll choose Hawaii because knowing them, they want to live somewhere.
No, they would probably choose places like Wyoming, Montana,
Uh-huh.
places like that, that
It's
are
a sort
just
of
like,
what Little House on the Prairie places. Was
yeah.
that? Is that where it's set? Little House on the Prairie. I'm not sure.
I don't know where Little House on the Prairie was set, but yeah, they'd just choose like these places out near the Midwest, and then they would want to make those
Flyover
like ethno.
country.
Yeah.
Uh huh. Right. Um, But that's the thing. I mean, what do you think of this idea of everybody peacefully separating? I mean, I think it's crazy because we know what happened to India under partition, and it wasn't very peaceful at all. Because you're going to have a lot of trouble saying, we're staying, but you're going. Off you
Hmm.
go, kind of thing. So I mean, it seems obvious to me that you just change the rules so people follow rules that are fairer for all concerned, so they can live together more peacefully. And when they complain about certain races not behaving themselves, then well, just make them behave themselves by proper law enforcement or something of that nature.
Well, it's just that's the problem is it's just like having a divorce. When you have a divorce, who's going to have the assets and who's going to have the property after the divorce? And they don't think like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a matter of just sort of getting to your wagon and, heading for, virgin territory or something because everything's taken up.
Yeah, it's not like those Basque homesteaders that, settled in the southeastern part of my state, that's for sure.
The what?
Oh, there was a Basque population that settled in the southeastern part of my state,
A
and a lot of them
Basque?
were homestead. Yeah,
As
from
as
Spain.
in from Spain?
Yeah.
Wow. And homesteaders, what, people who um, run ranches? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, they basically migrated over to the southern part of the southeastern part of the state, and then they set up a bunch of homes and ranches out there. And there's even like one place, I think it's called Jordan Valley, where they have a Bez Pelota court over there.
What was that? Sorry.
Bez Pelota is just like an old sport they played, so it's kind of similar to Jai Alai or other sports of that nature, where you have a ball and then you have like something where you hit the ball across the wall.
It sounds like
Um,
squash.
yeah, yeah, it's kind of a form of that.
Right, and it's a Native American game, is it?
No, it's like a lot of different cultures had a similar game of that, but I
Oh,
just know like the Spanish like to play that,
oh, right,
mainly
right.
the Basque,
Mm-hmm,
and then like in the Middle East, you had something called Jai Alai, which is kind of similar,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
but
And your state is Oregon, did you say?
yeah.
And well, how would you describe the characteristic of Oregon as an American state?
It's very contradictory because, like, in the bigger cities, it's super liberal and they're pretty much like a breeding hub for Antifa. And then outside of the big cities, it's mostly very conservative in the smaller towns. And it's weird because, like, on the western half of the state, it's mostly green grass, it's more rainy. But then on the eastern half of the state, it's all desert and it snows because it's in higher elevation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And would you say you know your own state quite well? Are you quite well travelled within it?
Yeah, there's a few places I haven't been to, but I've had when I've had the chance, I've traveled around quite a bit within
Mm-hmm,
the state.
mm-hmm. And do you I suppose I mean how are your survival skills? I mean, has any part of that your Native American heritage helped you in that, or do not are
I
you not
wasn't
known to?
raised in a rural area, so I don't really there's a lot of stuff I could learn for sure.
Right. No, no, because I mean, I guess if you're an Eskimo, I would be asking you about your seal hunting
Yeah.
skills and whatever. And and it occurs to me that maybe it's not so good now. I mean, if you were an Eskimo, because it's like, oh, all these sort of bossy people saying, oh, you can't club seals to death anymore because it upsets us, and no, you can't hunt whales anymore, even though it's the tradition of your ancestors, because that upsets us too, and that kind of thing, which
Well,
might.
it's just a well, it's stupid because it's like hearing some white leftists say, "Oh, you guys all got to be vegans now because ethically, if you kill an animal, you're torturing them, and that's not ethical." And it's like, have these idiots ever seen like a Komodo dragon eat its prey? That's the most horrifying shit I've ever seen.
What sort of is that a snake?
No, a Komodo dragon is a giant lizard, and it has this venom where when it bites its prey gets partially paralyzed, and then and then you see its prey screaming in pain as it's getting eaten alive.
Oh, and it doesn't even have the decency to kill the prey before eating it.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I'm saying. Like these people, like I agree. Like I would be perfectly fine with ending factory farming, but to say we shouldn't eat meat because it's an animal holocaust or or it's just unethical because it abuses animals, that's ridiculous. Humankind's been doing this for centuries.
Yeah, I mean, look at our teeth. I mean, we've got incisors and molars, so we're obviously meant to be eating both meat and veg.
Yeah, no, I hate this consequentialist ethical stuff though, because like there's this one guy who does YouTube videos who is making an argument that if somebody is a pedophile, as long as they don't hurt children, they should be allowed to view stuff and even touch stuff as long as it's not offending a child. And we should destigmatize these people and their attractions. And then the same the same clown was all saying that, oh, we should also support transracialism now.
What does that mean? Race mixing? That's all it means, isn't
No,
it?
transracialism is when, like, a really infamous case was there was a woman named Rachel Dolezal who joined the NAACP, and she pretended to be a black woman when she was a white woman.
Oh yeah, yeah. Huh. Yes. How annoying and confusing. But some people can carry it off. I don't know if you've heard of Ali G, uh, who's this
No, I haven't.
Jewish British comedian who um, is a very good mimic. So he gets into character, and he used to play a black character called Ali G, and he talked black, and he moved black, and he dressed black, and he went around convincing quite a few American politicians that he was black, even though he was in fact Jewish. And I mean, but his act was so good that he convinced everyone. So you'd be looking at this man who was obviously not black, but convinced he was because everybody else accepted him to be black, including those black American politicians who wanted to curry favor with black people, and that was what he basically
Well, it
did.
just makes me laugh when talking about this because it makes me think of the jazz pianist Keith Jarrett.
Uh huh. I'm not quite sure who. Okay, he's a
Well,
jazz pianist. You said.
yeah, but the funny thing about him is he had an afro, even though he was a white person. And then one time during backstage, um, a black musician asked him, "Are you black, Keith?" And his answer is, "I'm working on it."
Yeah, this reminds me of this documentary I saw but years ago, and basically it was this sort of British nationalist, and he was complaining about immigration, and he was a young man, and he had a girlfriend, and she was Chinese, or Oriental anyway. So everybody was
Oh
kind of
yeah,
saying,
that's a common trope with these white nats, is they will say that they're racist and all this stuff, and then they'll have an Asian girlfriend or an Asian wife.
yeah, and it's like they don't notice, they don't notice that this woman they are having sex with regularly is not a member of the white race, and they actually can't compute. Because there was this sort of exchange, in that documentary, because there were all these people going, excuse me, you're supposed to be a racist, but how come your girlfriend is Chinese? And he was saying, really? It are you Chinese? And she said, no, I ain't Chinese. And she was looking very Chinese. I don't know. It was just so strange. I still remember it. Um, and the identity issue was not resolved within that documentary anyway. But he did,
Right.
it seemed that he genuinely couldn't see it, and nobody could convince him. And, and so, I mean, this leads me to think that the problem is not, in fact, racial. I mean, people focus on it because they think, oh, we can't agree about what rules we should follow, but we can all agree about what colour we are, and we're all white, aren't we? It's that kind of attitude, because if they go deeper, within about what they can agree on, then in the end they'll have to start talking about religion, and then they'll really start fighting because of all these sort of European wars of religion that Christianity is so famous for. So I think they kind of want to focus on people's skin color, because at least they think it's reasonably objective, I think.
What was what was funny because I was reading a music book about the British invasion in the UK, and I found out because at the time the UK was an ethno state, but yet because there were different classes economically, there was ended up becoming different cultures. So you had all these different cultures that spoke a different vernacular. They had different fashion styles, different different ways of how they existed in society. So you even had like mods and rockers. So the mods were more nice looking. The rockers were more like the leather jacket types, and they'd get into fist fights sometimes.
Yeah, and some people just want to be different for the sake of being different, so they can fight with each other. This is the essence of the football game, right?
Hmm.
We're all the same, but yeah, let's have a good fight, because that's what we really enjoy. And I guess sport is a kind of proxy war. And when you think about it, it's like, there they were in Europe. They were all white. They were all the same religion, and look at them now. So I don't think it is really about race. I think it is about white men suddenly realizing that they have fallen in status.
Well,
And
that's the problem though in America is like what was considered a white race was mostly just Anglo-Saxon Protestants that settled in the country, and you had like a few Dutch and a few German immigrants there as well. And then what ended up happening is they created this a white identity later on, and assimilated other populations in like Italians, Jewish people, Polish people, and all these other people into an American identity to separate themselves from blacks and Native Americans and Mexicans. And then now it's like you get these CRT and leftist types saying, oh, well, race is a social construct, but we got to combat whiteness. And it's like, well, if you try to make white a category, then you're not really combating racism. You're also creating more racist in the process of that. Because if you want to combat against racism, you don't want to necessarily create like a colorblind society, but you want to create a society where people know what their differences are, but they're willing to coexist peacefully.
yeah, yeah, and also they were actually very mean to each other. These sort of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, I think, because um, this is what I've noticed about white people in America, that actually most of the white people in America anyway are from German extraction.
Hmm.
And actually quite few of them are from English extraction, and I suppose there were just more Germans because they were Catholic, and they just went around the world a
Yeah, it
bit
was
more.
mostly Protestants that came here first, and then Catholics when they came. Catholics came later on, like when the Irish and Italians immigrated here, and Irish and Italians were discriminated against. Some of them were indentured servants, and there was even Americans that were scared that they would take over the country with their Catholic religion, and there was a lot of fear mongering about that
Mm.
during the 19th century.
Yeah, and what I noticed about white people in America was that a lot of them came from German Irish extraction, because this is what E. Michael Jones said. I'm German Irish, and then I noticed that a lot of white nationalists come from that extraction, and there is this sort of peculiar ethnicity of Americans of Irish and German extraction, and then I realized it was because the Anglos wouldn't marry them because they were Catholic, so they had to marry each other because they were both Catholic, and that explains why there's so many Irish German Americans of Irish German extraction.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, but it also makes me laugh on the other side of the pond when you see people like Keith Woods, who's an Irishman, but then he wants to be a lapdog for the Anglos.
Yes, I suppose there's always this instinct to look for the most powerful group and then say, I will be your servant, because you're so cool and great and whatever. and I guess that that kind of works. And and one thing I discovered recently was the phenomenon of the Creole. I mean, I never thought about them at all. I mean, I just thought they were people with this sort of weird language, and then I realised that they were the people kind of created as a result of the British Empire that the British would use to deal with the black native populations of Africa.
Oh
Um,
yeah, like that's a good point because I remember reading a lot of books about early jazz history, and in Louisiana, you did have a lot of Creole people there because you had people that were ethnically mixed with blacks and Native Americans, and they had their own language and their own culture.
yeah, and, and so, I think ultimately, if you don't look beyond race, you will actually not be dealing with the problem because I think, eventually we will. Yeah, I mean, it's so obvious that people of one race are not going to agree with each other just because they look, they share the same skin color, and when keep then you think of different groups and then I guess if you think of yourself it's like well what you think of your view now wouldn't be a view that you would agree with in the past or what you feel now to be the truth may be revised at some point in the future so we ourselves don't even agree with ourselves all like all the way through and
Hmm.
maybe sometimes we do need to change our minds about things and
Right.
yeah and
Well, and see, that's the problem with nationalism in America is like to be a true American nationalist, you have to recognize all the ethnic groups that live in this country and not discriminate against them or make them second or third class citizens in their own country. And I mean, I understand like some people in my circles say freedom of association, but I think freedom of association just naturally happens. It's not something that has to be enforced by law.
yeah but I think um I think people have to be civic nationalists. I mean, if you're an empire, you have to be civic nationalists because your empire has all these different people, and really, if you're saying, oh, we're just taking you over, and we're gonna make you eat shit, we're gonna treat you badly, and you're actually creating a few. The source of future rebellion if you're not even outwardly nice to them so I guess all multicultural I mean all empires are multicultural and eventually in a successful empire you'll be saying we're all one family and we're all different but we're still but we're united and we all live together that kind of thing you have to say to keep all the different groups working with each other I guess.
Well, that's a problem Europe is facing now. Is you have this forced multiculturalism where you have these cultures that haven't really been there that long, and they're clashing because they don't really assimilate with each other.
Yeah, because um, um, it's not right that you should be completely ignoring, first your working classes, because they have a purpose. I mean, they're called the working classes because they're supposed to do the labouring work, and if you don't want to use them, and you put them on welfare, and then you invite legal and illegal immigrants and migrants to replace them, then you're creating a class that doesn't know what it's for. They'll either think we're so inferior that nobody will hire us, or we're so superior that we don't need to work when we can just claim welfare and watch
Well, that's
TV,
the problem in this
pay for
country.
food.
Is a lot of European and Black Americans are getting displaced from their jobs, and a lot because it first started with Black Americans, where a lot of them lost their jobs and became an underclass, and now a lot of white Americans are becoming an underclass because they're getting displaced from their work. So excuse me, so now you have like this professional managerial class or the manager class that pretty much runs the country, and the government's just a prop because they pretty much can decide what's in the media, what gets taught in the schools, um what we're going to do like with these companies because they all work in the tech industry or in the educational industry. So like our elected government's just a it's just
A
like a movie
front.
set. It's a movie set prop from a fucking Hollywood movie, because like what power do they even have sometimes if these private companies and private interests can just basically boss them around.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, all they do seem to be doing is they're like, please, 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 Amazon, will just pay some tax to make it look good on us, because it's a bit embarrassing that you haven't paid any taxes this year or something. So, and increasingly the fraud is becoming transparent, and I think the problem is that they don't understand that people need to feel that their government is governing them properly. And if they could just give a show of that, even if it's not true, but they can't even pretend, even for our sakes, to lie to us convincingly on that front. Because it's
Right.
so obvious that they have no power. That actually, however much we complain about censorship on YouTube, we have more free speech than they do. And they're too
Well,
terrified to discuss with each other what is to be done about anything.
yeah, yeah, and it's that's why it was so funny. You get these contradictions, like people in Congress saying, "Well, did Donald Trump pay his taxes?" And it's like, well, what about the taxes you guys didn't pay?
Yeah. And it is, and they don't seem to understand, because if they keep censoring us, then it means that they're not getting the information they need to know that they're governing badly and there's, trouble brewing, because um, basically you need to know how you're doing as government. So if I was, dictator, I would want to know what people thought. I wouldn't be shutting them up, because then, it would all go underground and I would know who were the troublemakers or whatever. So,
Well, a funny story about that. Mao in China did a thing called like the thousand. I think it was called
a
the
thousand
thousand flower.
flowers. Yeah.
Yeah. So what he did was he opened the doors for criticism, and then he used that as a weapon to just basically shut down all his dissenters.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the only way around that is really for everybody to complain and dox themselves and declare themselves, because then they wouldn't think of imprisoning everybody, because then they just wouldn't have the resources to do so, and then they realise that you know sensible people are still the majority. Yeah, unfortunately, everybody's scared, so they're just going to keep, I don't know, sucking it up, I guess.
Well, that's the thing too. Is like there's a fine line between um, free speech and criticism of government, which I think is a healthy thing, versus slander and lies and libels. So, for example, you've had Vice and other people write articles about you. I've seen other people I've known in circles I've talked to have like slanderous articles written about them.
Yeah, and the thing is, um, I pose for those photographs, in the expectation of being able to, argue with them and say, look, just because, I'm not really a Nazi, I just happen to be photographed near a flag, to make a point, because I wanted to associate myself with nationalism, because I think, that is really what people want. They want to feel that their government is governing in their national interest, and that is how nationalism should be defined. And once you define it in that way, then it becomes respectable and universal and legitimate, and not the failed, crazy ideas of Mussolini and Hitler, and the defeat and disaster of the Second World War. But
Well,
unfortunately,
that's the thing too, is like me being a cultural, I'm not really a civic nationalist, I'm more of a cultural nationalist. But being a cultural nationalist, you want, a good culture that your country can, feed off of, that's a healthy culture that, fosters growth, positive connections, and a positive bond, between the peoples of the country. And we don't really have that in America, because we have such a toxic culture, that we have all these different kinds of toxic cultures in this country that don't encourage any kind of growth. They don't encourage positive, healthy relationships. or even the family structure. So we have just all this madness and insanity that's just running rampant.
So, what is your religion, Carl?
I'm an Orthodox Christian, but but when I talk to other third positionists, like one of the big ones, like Culture Thug, he's more of a Nietzschean agnostic. So he's more philosophically grounded in the ideas of Friedrich Nietzsche, and um, and he's agnostic because he doesn't know, if there's a God or what God does. And myself, I have a different worldview because I am like a Christian. So I do believe that this is a fallen world. And I don't think people have it in their ability to create perfection on earth or to do things perfectly. But that doesn't mean to just give up and do nothing and just assume that, every woe is me, everything sucks, Jesus is going to come and do nothing at all type of thing, because that's stupid when people believe that crap.
Yeah, yeah, because it just makes them miserable and hopeless. So, did you all were you brought up an Orthodox Christian?
No, not at all. I was actually brought up as an evangelical, and then for a short period of time, I was following Great Millstone, and became for a very short period of time like a black Hebrew, like a Hebrew Israelite. And then after that, I kind of just got really bitter and skeptical, and just became an atheist for a short period of time before going back to the faith.
Right. So what do you think of Jay Dyer? I mean, was he in any way influential in making you become an Orthodox Christian?
I was going that direction way before I even encountered Jay Dyer's YouTube channels, because I was watching video. I think the person that like I first started listening to that kind of introduced me to some of those ideas was Theodore Schubot. But most of that was just kind of organic for me, watching a lot of videos of liturgies and stuff like that.
So what attracted to you to Orthodox Christianity?
Just the very spiritual nature of it, because I think that's something that's really lost in a lot of a modern society. Like we don't really have a very spiritual connection to the world outside of us, so we just have this very materialistic way of life and thought. Where we're just born to be these consumers, and you
Mm-hmm.
know,
Mm-hmm.
I could really see, like, that transformation now compared to when I was younger. Because now it's just like, I don't care about the new game console. I don't care about like a new television set or any of that garbage.
So was there some aspect of the ritual of Orthodox Christian worship that attracted you?
Yes, it was mostly the way they worship that attracted me to it, which would be, like I said, their liturgical ceremonies, how they worship God, their connection to God. And that's something that you don't really see a lot with Protestant Christianity.
I believe Orthodox Christians prostrate themselves, don't they?
Well, I know the Coptic ones do.
Right, but not all of them do. Because I know somebody, um, well, she converted to Orthodox Christianity, and um, then she mentioned the prostrations, and then I looked it up on YouTube and realized that yeah, they make prostrations, but not your Orthodox church.
I haven't attended a church yet, because the only thing they have in my city is a group meets up at this one Catholic school, and it's a very small group. So
Hmm.
I should go over there sometime. It's just that I've never actually. My problem is, like, I need to lose a lot of weight before I can fit into a nice pair of slacks.
Ah,
So
ah. But is it? I suppose I divide religion between its public and private aspect, and being a political activist, I concentrate on public morality, which is um, maintained by law, and what people really believe is obviously a matter for them. Some people have sensitive consciences and they get upset if they do something wrong, and some people just don't care. And so I suppose I see the law as the marker of whatever political orthodoxy that is um, in in force at the time, and and I suppose I do get a bit cynical about, well, okay, you go to a different church, than you used to go before, but how is that going to change the law? How is that going to change your politics? And I suppose that is a question I've been asking myself, and I suppose, with Islam, it's like, yeah, Muslims follow this book of rules called the Quran, and that's what they do, and there's a certain logic to that, and that's why I guess I think Islam must be the answer, because it's so straightforward about that.
Yeah, but even with Islam, you have all these break off groups. Like you have like a split between the Sunni and Shia, then you have the Sufis, then you have the Baha'i. So you have all these like splits that happen too
Oh
within.
yeah. I mean that would naturally happen, over time. But I guess if your countries have decided, oh well, we're just going to you know um, establish a theocracy, for example, and then there will be the government interpretation of everything, the official version, and so anybody who doesn't like it, well, it's just too bad, the government is above us and will do whatever it wants. And
Well, see, that's the thing. It's like I'm not in favor of a theocracy. I prefer to have a secular government, but a government with these, strong moral laws. And the thing is like the problem we're facing right now is that we've just let liberalism has just run its course and just contaminated the minds of people in the worst possible way.
yeah, and but I think the problem with liberalism is that it's like Hinduism. So it started in the late 1700s. I mean, if you're gonna include the American Revolution in the establishment of liberalism, then obviously over the past 250 years, it's changed because circumstances have changed, and different politicians claiming to represent liberalism have put their stamp on liberalism, so now it contradicts itself. And it isn't particularly coherent, and the rules keep changing, and I think the
Hmm.
fact that the rules keep changing is what is driving everyone mad.
Oh yeah, and that's why we're having like I feel like the biggest revolution we're having right now is mostly coming from the reactionary camp because we're having like a very big reactionary and conservative uprising because that's really the only way you can fight against this system is to have a more conservative or reactionary worldview compared to like, this global homo stuff that they're pushing.
Yeah, so that means restoring the patriarchy, and this means, things like, no more gay marriage, no more gay sex, or if you want to do it, you make sure nobody knows that you're doing it, and no more fornication, and then you get back to this moral order that everybody seems to be so nostalgic for, where the government used to support marriage and the family, and there were all these mother-in-law jokes because, well, the mother-in-law would come and visit.
Well, like, what was I thinking of? Well, that's funny because like, shoot, I was on to something and then sometimes I lose my train of thought and that's frustrating. But I was thinking about this too because I mean, you see communists like Infrared, for example, and he's trying to push, the more conservative direction and trying to recruit, apolitical people and right wing people into communism, and a lot of people and pushing, him and Caleb Boppin and Jackson are pushing like this patriotic socialism stuff, and a lot of other Marxist Leninists are pissed off and mad because it's not as socially liberal as they would want it to be.
Well, it sounds like, the National Socialism thing again, right? Because if you think about Nazi Germany, it was a reaction against the Weimar Republic, which was very liberal. So in a way, you can understand why they kind of went the other way when, Hitler said,
Now I
no
remembered what
more
I
of
was going to
this.
say, though. Now I remember what I was going to say. Yeah, because like a good example of like a conservative pushback that turned into a revolution would be the Iranian Revolution when they overthrew the Shah. Remember that?
Oh yeah, yeah, and the thing is, for nationalists, I keep pointing this out, and they never accept it because they hate Islam so much. But before the Iranian Revolution, the Shah was an American puppet, a Western puppet. And
Hmm.
when they had the Iranian Revolution, suddenly they were able to defy the might of America and its allies. So that's what it did for Iran. Yeah, we can think, oh, but it's a bit much. It sounds a bit scary. But then, I hear all kinds of things about Iran now, like Michael Jones saying, well, that they're not having children, whatever. And I thought, oh, why they're not having children? Oh, because they're on the pill. And then there's a lot of cohabitation going on in Iran, and that's why their birth rate is lowering. So they have the pill in Iran. I mean, I know that.
Yeah.
So it sounds quite liberated to me. And the Iranian girls that I knew when I was at school, well, they were up to all kinds of things. They certainly weren't, buttoned up and prudish.
Well, and that's the problem too. It's like when you have a conservative revolution, it doesn't always stay conservative for too long once modernity creeps in.
Well, I think it's only because everybody in the end they'll say, well, why can't I have sex with this person? Who's gonna get hurt? Nobody will know, or whatever. And then I guess they all start doing it, and then it becomes condoned, and then everybody admits they've been doing it too, and then it becomes part of the culture again. But there are these rules in the book of rules called the Quran, and it's like, well, any advanced civilization has to support the institution of marriage and the family, or they decline and degenerate. And what happens if people practice too much free love is that they won't have stable marriages, which means they won't have stable families, and then their birth rate will decline, and they will lessen the likelihood of fighting a successful defensive war. And that was really essentially what it was all about. It was a kind of race to have, um, the most the best quality men of fighting age who would listen to the wisdom of their elders. And if you get that right, you will have a strong nation. But if you mess it up, then you'll end up being invaded and taken over.
Well, that's why Theodore Schubert made a good point in America that it's just dumb how people want to overturn Roe v. Wade or outlaw abortion when most women are just taking the pill and the pill is stopping, babies from being born.
Yeah, and I said this to Greg Johnson a few years ago. It's like, well, if you're really so concerned about your birth rate, what you could do, Greg, is to give the pill to all these non-white women in your country and withhold it from your own women, and then you'll have a rising, white birth rate. You could do that, but of course he wasn't going to do that. He would prefer to kick them all out, that sort of thing. Um, but you can actually regulate this uh, you know babies and sexual relations by withholding the pill from
Well, I mean,
people who are
that's
not
what
married to
well
make them
that's like
marry
what
earlier.
well that's like what communist Romania and communist Albania did is they would do programs to encourage women giving birth, but Romania took it so far that like they would send doctors into factories to check on women's stomachs to make sure their babies were healthy.
Yes, but because it is true what they say about demographics being destiny. And you look at the old civilizations about how they forced okay, women to be chained, barefoot to the to the kitchen sink, and all that. Um, and and obviously, if most women work, they're going to have a low birth rate, and then their children aren't going to be that well parented
But
because
that's why it was crazy in a communist country like Albania, where it was a secular atheistic country, and they declared themselves the first atheist state. And in spite of like making changing laws around to where women were allowed to divorce their husbands, they still had like a high birth rate, and they were still a more conservative society at the time than America was.
Yes. Yes, I mean, I don't know what kind of society they are now. I mean, what I've noticed about Romanians is that they have they speak excellent English. Really.
Let's talk about Albania. I don't know what Albania is like now either. I think religion, of course, came back, so now you have a lot of Muslims and Christians there. So Enver Hoxha's quest to destroy religion was a failure in the long run.
Yeah, because I think, patriarchy can only be supported by theocracy because, all the, the five world religions are basically, patriarchies. And, or any successful civilization or empire, there would be patriarchies. And then, when they start to decline, it would be because they kind of relaxed those rules too much and ended up with a declining birth rate. As we know, the Romans suffered, and then, from a people that were good at war, they became an empire that paid um, mercenaries because they couldn't even fight their own wars anymore, and then ended up being taken over. And I guess America is kind of where that's at now. Because after too many imperial wars, I guess white Americans think, well, I'm not going to join the army if I'm going to get killed for some pointless war that whose purpose I can never understand, and come back in a body bag, and so I guess the American government will have to end up paying mercenaries, and mercenaries take a long time to do what you pay them to do, or don't do them at all, which is
Yeah.
what Machiavelli said about how Rome fell because they couldn't trust their own people to join the army, so they paid mercenaries, and they basically didn't do what they were supposed to do.
Right. Well, and it's funny too because like you on the other side of communism, you look at a country like Eastern Germany, and they were more socially progressive than some of the other countries, and they ended up having falling birth rates before the Berlin Wall was destroyed.
Yes, I think basically if you divorce um, recreational sex from marriage, if you say non-married people can enjoy recreational sex with each other, then people will kind of choose it because obviously most people don't want to have babies every time they have sex, right? So
Right.
once they know how to manage it, yes, of course your birth rate will decline.
Oh yeah, definitely, and that's usually the consequence. I mean, Japan's having a big problem with their birth rates now.
Yeah, they went on the pill in the 1990s, I think 1995. And for ages, the Japanese doctor said, no, 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 we're not going to go on the pill. And then eventually they said yes. And, and, and now we know that they're not getting married. There are lots of incels. They're closing down
Yep.
their hospitals and schools now. So,
Yeah, the incel problem's pretty big, and it's something that should be fixed, in my opinion. But these are like these are like big problems that don't always have like the easiest of solutions, and the only way you can really solve these problems is to change the culture.
you can only change a culture through changing, I'm afraid, the religion. And I know it's too much for people to contemplate because of their, the perceived identity of Americans. But what I've been trying to say to Americans is that, look, really the American Republic has Islamic roots. And the evidence is all around, well, in the White House, with the White House Quran, which belonged to Thomas Jefferson, and we know he must have read it, and the First Amendment can be traced to chapter 2, verse 256 of the Quran that says, there is no compulsion in belief, truth stands clear from error. And I don't know, were you aware that five of the founding fathers were not Christian?
Oh, I was aware of it, but it's you tell like to average Americans that, and they just don't. It goes in one ear and out the other because they're like, oh, they were deist and this and that, universalist, Unitarian. No, they don't. They don't. They don't know that. They're just. There's a lot of dumb people in this country.
But I think that there probably was a conspiracy to pretend that the founding fathers were in fact good Christian gentlemen. I
Yeah,
mean,
well, I know for a fact they weren't because they were just more they were of an upper class, so they were like more exposed to a lot of stuff the commoner wasn't exposed to. So they had a lot more knowledge of certain things the most common Americans didn't have knowledge of.
hmm. Well, the thing was that there was a lot of Christian on Christian religious persecution that came with the Pilgrim Fathers, weren't they? I mean, we know from the stories of Nathaniel Hawthorne that the Quakers and the Puritans were fighting and sometimes
Well, yeah,
killing
because
each
like
other.
the Quakers were very liberal, and they were kind of like they were a very progressive sect of Christianity compared to like the Puritans, who were more Calvinist in their nature.
Yes. And the thing about Calvinism, which I discovered some years ago, was that, I just couldn't work out why Calvinism was so popular because, the idea was of predestination was that, oh,
Yeah, I hate
you can't even be
Calvinism.
saved through good works, you're either saved or doomed and, only God knows. And I thought that's so gloomy. It's like, well, you want to make it even harder for people to get into, to heaven. And then I realized that Calvin was the one who said it was okay to practice usury. And that's why he was so popular. It wasn't because of his, Calvinism and his predestination.
Well, and a lot of Calvin's ideas came from Saint Augustine, so he was using a lot of Augustine's ideas. And the interesting thing about Augustine himself is that, or Augustine, as people would call him, is that he himself used to be a Manichaean Gnostic. So some of his Manichaean ideas kind of translated to Christianity, even though he claimed not to be a Manichaean anymore. You could see, some of those influences, in his writings and his worldview, because like Manichaeans viewed the flesh as an evil thing, and they thought intercourse between two humans was the worst thing you could do. And then you look at his views on sex, and he views sex as like a disgusting act. And I think that did kind of carry over from his Manichaean influences.
Yes. So it seems that Christianity is a religion of extremes because if you're asking people to remain celibate all their lives, I mean you are asking a lot about them, and obviously we know what happened to the Catholic Church because it was kind of a recruitment drive for gay men to enter Catholic seminaries because yeah, if I were male and gay and Catholic and didn't want to marry, then obviously a Catholic seminary would be the place for me. Because then, nobody would ever rat on you because they would be ratting on themselves.
Well, yeah, there was a lot of predators that entered the church. And I mean, that wasn't as big of a problem with the Orthodox Church because at least priests are allowed to marry. I think the only ones that couldn't have sex were monks, mainly. Because, like, if you were a monk, then you were basically giving your entire life to God, and your whole life was just basically in service to God. So you weren't, allowed to engage yourself in any worldly things. Because, like, there was a really interesting documentary I ran into one time where there was this Australian guy who was an atheist, and then after his mother died, he traveled over to Egypt, and when he encountered the Coptic monks, it changed him so much that he became a monk himself, and then he just lives out in the desert spending all of his days praying.
Hmm. So he became an ascetic, um,
Yes.
like a yoga, yogic person. I don't know. Hmm. Do you ever think to become a monk in a monastery,
No.
that sort of thing?
No, I enjoy the company of women way too much to ever have that amount of self-discipline.
I mean, I know a few, female relations and say, then I think I'll join join the convent or something because there's a kind of, I don't know, a kind of romantic renunciation of thinking you're going to join a nunnery, um, but, but obviously it's unnatural, and Islam doesn't encourage it because it doesn't even have a priesthood, and it dispenses with, and the um, people closest to becoming to being a priesthood in Islam would be the judiciary, because they're the ones called to interpret the laws of the Quran. So I guess that would be the high level input. Um,
Well, yeah, that's the thing. Is like Islam and Judaism don't have that issue because Judaism and Islam both, like, have a different cultural tie to its people. So yeah, you don't have like these monks that, spend their entire life, not getting laid and not enjoying, the company of another female. I mean, I don't know where that came about or how that was created, but it is kind of funny when you think of it that way, or you just become a man who's celibate his entire life and he spends his whole life, doing the works of God and everything.
hmm. But the Jews, when they had their temple, they had a priesthood, and it didn't help them, did it? Because when they had their temple and their priesthood, they did all kinds of things, and the Romans invaded, and they didn't like the Romans, and then they rebelled, and the Romans were mean to them and kicked them out. But it seemed to that narrative of their history suggests that the priesthood didn't do them any good either, because they were obviously corrupt. The Sadducees, they didn't care about the people. They didn't believe in an afterlife. It was the Pharisees who believed in that sort of thing, and I guess rabbis today are descended from the Pharisees, who were, stickler for the rules. And so it seems to suggest that maybe you don't need a priesthood. You just need people who are, you know, who have internalized the principles of your religion, and that is how you pass on your tradition, by actually knowing, what your religious principles are, and not just having a temple where, occasionally an animal is sacrificed, but whose priesthood is corrupt, like the Christian priesthood, it seems to me.
Well, that's the thing. That's why I feel like a lot of theocracies just kind of failed in the long run due to inside corruption. Because once you had corruption within the religious institutions, that there just wasn't anything that was going to keep it afloat. I mean, that was a big problem in Russia with the Orthodox Church over there until the Bolsheviks came in, took over the country, and just basically started just raising hell amongst them because they just didn't have a stable institution over there.
Well, I think it's also to do with the nature of Christian scripture, because, well, even Christians don't say it came from God, because it was written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and Paul, and, there is no unity of authorship. While, I guess the Jews will say, well, the Torah, it comes from God, and the Muslims will say the Quran comes from God, and, we follow the rules in this book of rules from God. And therefore they have managed to keep their identity, better than Christians, who have basically allowed their priesthood, their corrupt priesthood, to make up the rules and change them from time to time, which they have over the centuries.
Well, see, that's why I kind of go back to where my roots are and say that I agree that this is a fallen world. So, like these religious institutions, even if they are built, on the best of intentions, are not always going to be like on the most stable ground, 100%, of the time, because they'll have these periods of time where they'll do well, but then you get these people that are just corrupt and they start, acting against the interest of their spiritual beliefs. And sometimes you do need a strong state to just shake things up and, put a boot down a few people's throats, so to speak.
Yeah, and and I suppose ultimately, I mean, we're talking about the rule of law, aren't we? We're talking about,
Yeah.
not just rules, but the, desire to follow the rules, or the duty, the moral duty to go by the rules, which is breaking down. And I think we see the difference between the Abrahamic faiths, who actually, they have the rule of law when they were following their own religious principles properly, Well, the Eastern religions, they kind of make it up, and, and they have, in my view, inferior scripture, or principles that are hard to apply. And which people don't really apply. I mean, basically people need to be told, like, we do this, we always do this, but we never do that. And that is part of our religious identity, rather than, memorizing a whole bunch of principles like the, I don't know, Five Noble Truths or whatever, and being expected to apply them, but, not, not, not being able to do it, or not remembering to apply these rules, and then eventually going wrong. Because all successful empires are um, about the rule of law, and changing the laws, or making them better, and that kind of thing.
Oh
And
yeah, and it's interesting you bring that up because I was reading in the book Why Liberalism Failed. The last chapter I read talked about how in our colleges we used to have the liberal arts, which were founded on religious texts and other foundational texts throughout history, and most of our colleges have abandoned that now.
yes, and I think the problem with that is that if you lose a narrative, if most people in your country don't know, a story, and it doesn't even have to be a true story, because maybe we saw the same Disney cartoon, when and we would have a connection with each other, and even if we all knew it was fiction, if it was a Greek myth, I mean, we would actually, because we know the same story, have a natural connection with each other. And
Oh
if you
yeah,
lose a natural narrative, then it will
yeah.
be
See, that's
harder
a
to
good
connect
point.
with your fellow citizen.
That's a good point because myths are even like good at connecting a society together because like Sorel broke off from a lot of Marxists when he came up with the idea of the myth and said that the myth is a good way of connecting the proletariat, and that was also something that happened with the Italian fascist, was the idea of the myth of this country that connected that united Italy and made Italy a united nation versus having all these separate people with separate views, because once you have this mythic thing that these people have a connection to, it brings these people together. And that's something that's killed the kind of America right now, is we don't really have a wider thing of connecting people together. Instead it's just strip malls, McDonald's, um
Hmm.
lewd music videos, and fast food.
Yeah,
And
and more movies about Marvel superheroes, which,
yeah.
what's that about? Uh, and so I think, um, but we don't need to worry about that too much, because national identity, I think, always changes when you have a revolution, you have a war, you have an invasion. It's like, these are the three circumstances in which the national narrative is changed, whether you like it or not. So I guess in a way the way is clear.
Right, and that's why like some of the philosophy I understand, like whether it be from Gentili or some other philosophers, they do kind of bring up a decent point that even though I despise war, sometimes war does rebirth the nation, because you saw that happen in Russia. When the Bolsheviks won the Civil War, it was a rebirth of that nation into the Soviet Union. Or like when the black shirts took over Italy, that was their rebirth. But they made a mistake of going into war, and that just like that bit them in the ass in the long run.
Well, I think that is a problem with these European dictators. They're always in a hurry. They don't
Yeah.
consolidate. It's like, I want it now in my lifetime, and I'm going to invade all these countries, and I don't care. And I think that was what obviously happened to Napoleon, but
Yeah,
the
exactly. Napoleon made the same mistakes, and he also decided to go into Russia, and that was a massive failure.
yeah, and Hitler did the same thing. But
Exactly.
Bismarck was the one who said, well, I don't, let's do it in stages. Let's win the war against Austria. and then we'll fight France, and when we do that, everybody will think we're so cool and want to unite with us and Greater Germany, and so they did, and it took place by, obviously Hitler went too far, but Bismarck had limited aims, and he well, I mean, eventually he was sacked by the new Kaiser, so I guess that was you know the problem in that suddenly Germany found it herself united and stronger, and it scared Britain, and Britain wanted to pick a fight with it to stop it from becoming too powerful, and that was a consequence of two world wars. But after that, America was a beneficiary because the empire of the Europeans just passed on to the Americans, and
Right,
may
it did.
yeah, and maybe
Well,
they're not grown up enough to run it properly. I don't know.
well, and see, like when I was on the Crucible, I was talking about the might makes right thing about ethics, and then Synth was trying to say, well, doesn't that mean that neoliberalism is on top because we are like stronger than everybody else? And I mean, yeah, for now, but not forever. I mean, it's gonna fall like any other empire does.
Yeah, because the American people themselves don't want any neoliberalism because it means uncontrolled mass immigration, and they hate that, and they don't want neocon wars, in which they're expected to die for no reason that they can see. So, if your own people don't support it, then it won't carry on. And if you want to
And
bring
it's
in,
not going to carry on because it's got too many contradictions. Because on a class level, like I said, the managerial class has too much control over society. They're telling people what to do. And I mean, some of this stuff I really can't talk too much about on here, concerning, medical related stuff, if you know what I mean. But
mm-hmm.
they're trying to do these things where they want to mandate and mold society into like the Play-Doh or clay shape they want it to be, and people are starting to get fed up with it, and they're starting to say, we don't like this isn't what we want, and they're getting pushback from it.
Yes, and the they don't quite see really that I suppose they think, oh, that these people we've fed them, and they've got their porn, haven't they? I mean, what more do they want? And I think what the people want is self-respect, to not be blatantly lied to,
Hmm.
and to feel that the right people are in charge, and then we'll be quiet, and then we'll trust the government, and then we will obey, but only if we think that the right people are in charge. And we're not impressed at the um, accident prone governments that we get, because what they do doesn't make sense.
Right. And see, the thing is it's surprising because at least, in America, they recognize these contradictions and they're trying to act against it. But then I look at Western Europe, and Western Europe is just cucked beyond belief.
Yes, but I suppose with Europe, their degeneracy goes back longer. In
Yeah.
that they basically did it to themselves after the, well, two world wars. They fought it about nothing, and then I guess they felt I don't know, they turned to wine, women, and song to take their mind off things. So they are in a worse state of degeneracy than
Well, it makes me
Americans.
laugh. It makes me laugh because they try to use it as a means of saying we're more open and progressive than America, but yet they're turning in some of these countries are turning into dystopian hellscapes. And I imagine, like, even in there, it's not going to be sustainable in the long run. Like, all this liberal bullshit is eventually going to collapse within its own contradictions over time.
Yeah, I mean,
It can't hold up for too much longer.
and in particular because liberalism in the 21st century, it doesn't mean free speech, it doesn't mean freedom of contract, it doesn't mean freedom of association, it just means free love. And that is what they're pushing on us. It's like, oh, you're feeling a bit upset, have some more sex.
Yeah, Brave
With
New
the
World
different
type
kind of,
shit.
yeah, yeah. And that's all it is, and I think people are wising up to it.
Well, and that's the thing too, is like one of the biggest contradictions I'd say that liberalism has and this is what even advocates of classical liberalism don't get, is that liberalism is always going to end up becoming a dictatorship over time, especially once it becomes a democracy.
Yes, because this is what E. Michael Jones said. Because he seemed to, I can't remember his exact words, but he who controls sexual morality controls the discourse, because that is the most basic human relationship that we're ever going to have with somebody else, and if that's wrong, then obviously our society will go to pieces. If people no
Hmm.
longer have you know sexually reproductive relationships with each other, that will obviously have implications for the next generation, and that kind of thing.
Well, yeah, and it's crazy because like when I talk to people like my grandma, she'll tell me stuff like, in the past you could, if you lived in a nice neighborhood, especially in a rural area, nobody locked their doors, everyone trusted each other, and now it's just like everyone's got it's like we don't have that high trust in society anymore. So doors have to be locked, fences have to be built, people have to enclose themselves in because they don't trust each other.
Yes, and children can't play anymore in safely, and they probably don't want to, because they prefer their computer games, through which they can access porn, you know which is getting them hooked on sex, at a young age, and telling them that they can be transgender, at primary school.
Yeah, like we're getting hypersexualized too, where sex is just a casual activity and it's not something that's like, tied to the reproduction of the country and and the cycle of life. It's just more of like some throwaway. It's not look it's just the immorality and of all of this is just not good. I mean, it's not healthy for a society to continue the direction it's going, because like I said, the contradictions within it are just going to implode it.
Yeah, I mean, I often think of the Aztecs. It's like, at one point did they realize that it didn't make any more difference, that they found more people to sacrifice, and, tear their hearts out and throw them down the pyramids. It's like, what kind of insanity made them continue to do that, thinking it was going to help, until the Spanish invaded, what,
Well, it's crazy too because like in countries like El Salvador and a few others, they ended human sacrifice decades or even centuries before the Aztecs did.
yeah. Huh, huh. And I don't think we are capable of correcting it unless people actually, examine how, you know, I think, it's sex and drugs that the government is increasingly saying, hey, let's legalize, pot, let's legalize, coke, let's legalize, all these different kinds of drugs, because they want to keep us stupefied, because they don't want
Hmm.
us to plot revolution, or think too much. And I think fundamentally, they don't care anymore. And the irony of it is, what the British did to the Chinese, during the Opium Wars, America is doing to its own population. You know, you
Yeah.
know.
It's sad but true.
Yeah, and it's not just drugs, but it's sex as well. It's like, just be quiet.
Well, yeah,
Watch
like
what.
decades ago when I was younger, it was sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Mm. And I suppose, the corrupting nature of okay, I guess it's not obviously corrupting, because maybe we don't look different after having sex with whoever, but eventually I think it does affect our minds, because maybe we will treat relationships as disposable because we've had so many already, and not be able to bond with each other properly, which means we will be bad parents, and our children will be bad children, and everybody, that sort of thing.
Hmm.
Hmm.
But then it just cycles back to where we were at in the beginning of this discussion. It's always darkest before it goes dawn.
And I like to think that there is a solution, but maybe it'll. Well, I guess we need to stare into the abyss for a bit longer and realise there is only one left, one religion that can.
Well, I would say also on a philosophical level, it kind of also goes to like Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West, because that book pretty much chronicles how all civilizations have like a life cycle where they have their they're born, they go through adolescence, they go through adulthood, but then they decline and die over time before a new civilization creates. And that's why like this whole preservation of this, preservation of that, I don't even think that's possible. I think that the only thing that's possible is to just have something new, rise in the ashes of whatever's left.
Yes, I mean, people worry about Western civilization, and I mean, what is the West? Is it a political entity, or a geographical expression? And I suppose there will always be people living in America or England or whatever, although the government might change and its religion might change and it might call itself a different name after being invaded or after a revolution. And I think the source of potential renewal is, always at hand, except that, maybe we're not ready for it, we can't face the idea quite yet, but I guess it's time to
Well, no,
consider it.
I know this is going to be a spicy take for some people, but I'm just going to be blunt here. Demographics are going to change, culture's going to change. So you have to go with the flow and know how to manage that, or you're just going to be swept into the trash bin of history if you can't.
Yeah.
So all these people that want to hold on to like, a demographic, or they want to hold on to a culture, it's not always going to work that way. So you either roll with the punches, or you just get swept up into the trash bin of history, and no one's going to give a damn about what happened to you, a century later.
Yes, I think culture is a product of morality and law, and you know so I think if we focus too much on the culture, I think we're putting the cart before the horse.
Yeah,
Because
well, there's a
if
lot
you
of
get the right
nations.
rules, then the right culture will emerge anyway.
Well, because I was going to say too, is there's a lot of nations, languages, cultures, ethnicities that no longer exist today, and they're never returning because of things that have happened. I mean, nobody's crying about nobody's crying about the fact that Tasmanians don't exist anymore, and that they were like wiped off the map of history, or that this one tribe that used to live in this one island in the Chatham Islands no longer exist anymore because they were wiped off the map of history. They're not crying about that. So this hypocrite, this hypocrite, sorry, this hypocrisy of like, oh, it's bad for me but not for thee.
Hmm.
Who cares at the end of the day? It's you're gonna be you're gonna be in that part of the history just as much as anybody else is. And it's history. It's just like it goes back to like Decline of the West and all these other aspects of how cycle. Life has. Sorry, I'm sometimes a suck with words, but it just goes into this cycle of that you're gonna be born, you're gonna live, and you're gonna die, and sometimes that just happens in life. Some people
Hmm.
aren't always going to win in history. And yeah, it's nice that you had a group of people that created great civilizations, great culture, and all this stuff, but that's not going to last forever, like in nothing else does. So you just have to know how to adapt and survive and evolve to what's going to happen later on.
But don't you think religion is such a helpful tool for us, or
Well, religion's
to
something that's
correct ourselves? You know,
but I was going to say religion is something that's eternal, so that's something that will never die.
because I think for the Abrahamic God, if it is true that he exists, then and all good and evil come from him, uh, then it means that if we suffer, it must be punishment for sin. And if we think in this way, we can say, oh, we're suffering, so we must have sinned. What have we been doing wrong? And then we go through the list and think, we better not do all those things that we've been told are sins, and then we correct ourselves, right?
Yeah,
And
and
then
you
the
look at
problem is solved.
well, and you look at any collapsing society, most of these collapsing societies become very sinful in their nature because they either become greedy, the bureaucracy becomes corrupt, the people become immoral, their culture
There
just
is always
completely falls
sexual
apart.
corruption, and from that, all kinds of moral corruption, and then intellectual corruption, and eventually, insanity, dementia, and amnesia. I think
Yes.
that but it always starts with sexual corruption, because
Well,
people can't see the harm of it when they first do it.
well, that's why I say like my country has the perfect president because he's perfectly
In
symbolic of
every
where this
sense.
country
Well, at least you haven't got a gay president yet,
yeah, yet.
but you may have a female
Don't
president
don't
soon.
don't jinx it. Don't jinx it. We might actually get one if you think about it.
Yes, and before we go, I think, okay. Recently, I've been looking at the failure of the extinction theory of the Easter Islanders, and
Hmm.
I didn't know that they were so technologically advanced. These Micronesians with their catamaran. I mean, they invented the catamaran apparently, and that's why they managed to colonize so many of these scattered islands in the Pacific, and and
Hmm.
um, and so they were so technologically advanced that people still, aren't quite sure how they managed to, carve those statues and, move them around and stand them up and whatever. And so at the time, they were really they were the technocrats of the time, you know, in that they could,
Right.
do that. And but because they were I'm going to say idolaters, they eventually failed because they didn't have an evolved system of morality to make them correct their mistakes. And
Well, that's another thing too that people today don't understand is there was a lot of advanced societies that have existed in the past that completely vanished from history due to collapse. And we only know like the tip of the iceberg of what a lot of these older societies knew about like, life, technology, nature, and all these other things they had access to at the time.
yeah, and I know I go on about the seven no-hide laws. It's a kind of tick list of sin. It's like if you've done those, then you've obviously done wrong. So correct yourself. It's really easy. There's only seven of them. You don't. It's not rocket science. And the other thing about, I guess, the more difficult to understand prohibitions against idolatry and blasphemy is that well, somebody pointed out to me yesterday, like, oh, you just think the only religions that are acceptable to the Abrahamic God is Judaism and Islam, and I kind of thought, well, yeah, because there's a book of rules, and it's kind of set in stone, and you can't just mess around with the wording and pretend it's not there. So that's why I propose that these books be used, but obviously the Jews, it's too hard for the Jews to follow, and that's why they break all the rules, and that's why they're hated, and also, for the Jews, they're supposed to teach the Noahide laws, and they haven't been doing it, which is why you get these three global Christian empires who are still in existence, and and I think the problem is idolatry, because if you technically you're an idolater if you ain't if you're not following Judaism and you're not following Islam, and and that kind of suggests that the rule of law is the most important thing to keep
Hmm.
our empire, if we have one together, and to keep people reasonably happy if you follow those rules, and
Yeah.
and I guess that's really what I'm trying to say, really.
Yeah, that's a good point. And like one last thing I was going to bring up is like another good book on how societies collapse is this book called Collapse: How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed from Jared Diamond. And another couple interesting books that like kind of influenced my thought process was some books that what's his name again?
John Gluck?
Um, no, no, no. Is the author that wrote like four arguments for the gerrymander. He wrote this book called Four Arguments Against the Elimination of Television, and all the stuff he says that television does that has a negative effect on the brain, it's almost like sevenfold with this internet stuff. And then he also wrote a really interesting book called An Absence of the Sacred, and it talks about how like modernity and technology has kind of removed us from a lot of our spiritual roots.
Hmm. I hope you will email these books to me so
Oh
I
yeah,
can put them in the
definitely.
description. I'm sure, people would like to read them, or it would benefit them to read them.
For sure.
Yes. Great. Well, thank you very much, Carl,
You're
for.
welcome.
Are you calling yourself after Karl Marx, or were you ever a leftist or something?
I was at one point, but the name Karl was more of a reference to Karl Otto Pytel. That's why I called it the other Karl, because Karl Otto Pytel was the author of the National Bolshevist Manifesto, but I don't really share any of those views anymore.
Oh, so um, did you go to university and
No,
study politics, or
no, I'm self-educated.
right? And it seems that when people are self educated, I think that they're far more reasonable than people who've been to university because they don't have these cookie cutter woke views.
Yeah.
Correct. Oh, all right then. Oh, and you're an Orthodox Christian. Does that mean you celebrate Christmas on a different day or something?
No, I think it's the same day.
Right, right. Because I know the Russians celebrate Easter or something, a bit later or
Yeah,
something.
I guess I would say I'm more culturally orthodox just because I don't really attend church because I haven't had the chance to. So I guess that's kind of more of a cultural thing for me than and it is kind of a religious thing on a personal level, but I haven't read the Bible in years, to be honest. Like I haven't read much of it, even though I used to read it a lot in the past. And
Do you
yeah,
have
it's
favourite parts, verses that you'd like to share with us?
there's some good verses here and there, but it's been so long that like I used to have these things memorized in my head, and it's been a while.
Right. You can't think of one. Do you have um, I like the one I can remember because I just quoted it today at someone, which is um, God created good and evil, which used to be a puzzle for me. It's like, why would he create evil, you know? And I thought, I think it's because you can't create good without creating evil.
Well, I mean, there's an interesting verse in Genesis that kind of does go back into like the concept of the fall, where man wanted to know the knowledge between good and evil, and now that that's a part of mankind, mankind gets to experience the consequences and the benefits of knowing good and evil and right and wrong.
Yes, and also man, I guess wanted to be like God. That's why he couldn't resist. Like, yes, I want to eat from the tree of life, and that tree of knowledge, and I will be like God.
Well, that's why, when these mere mortals try to be God, like when they get into the status of dictatorship, it usually does lead to long-term failure
And
unless they're more benevolent in nature.
yes, and I don't think it would be much fun being God because I guess you'd be always so disappointed with people, and it would just be having to deal with their requests, and and knowing they never send you thank you letters, that kind of thing. But I think the idea, I think that is that we are supposed to ask stuff from God, and it's supposed to please him, but because he's omnipotent, and therefore he doesn't mind, people asking him for stuff, because it means at least they're acknowledging his existence. And I guess as an agnostic, I think it's actually therapeutic to kind of okay, prayer, I think, focuses our mind. So obviously I want things to happen, so I kind of I have to formulate my prayers, and I think in a way, if you formulate them like terms of a contract, you kind of focus your mind on exactly what you want, and maybe that will help you get what you want by being precise about what it is you hope for, because you know Christmas is coming up, and there are people who say, I don't care what you get me, any little thing will do, but and then it becomes awkward. But if they say, I want this thing, and you can get it at that shop, and then it becomes easier to do, and they're more likely to get, to get that thing from you, because they've made it easy for you to give it to them. That's what I'm trying to say, I think.
Hmm. All right. Well, thanks for having me on.
Thank you for coming, and I wish you a happy Christmas, Carl,
Thank you.
and a happy New Year.
Thanks. Same as well.
Thank you.